Welcome back to the Grep News Podcast. I'm Bam Rather, and our show today is about a massive maritime operation that resulted in the seizure of 4 million barrels and left 105 people dead. So, the United States Coast Guard is currently in the Caribbean, hunting oil tankers. And I need to be clear here, not metaphorically, not as some kind of figure of speech. They're actually out there, working with Navy vessels, seizing Panama flag tankers carrying Venezuelan crude. And according to official counts, at least 105 people are dead from airstrikes on boats the U.S. says were involved in drug trafficking. Let me say that number again. 105. And here's the thing. Here's what makes this story feel like we've slipped into some alternate timeline. President Trump has declared what he's calling a total and complete blockade of Venezuelan oil shipments. A blockade. That word has specific meaning in international law. It's not a metaphor. It's the kind of thing that happens between nations at war. The timeline accelerated fast. The airstrikes began in early September. Vessels in the southern Caribbean Sea and eastern Pacific. The U.S. didn't announce locations, just international waters. Very specific, very transparent. Then in mid-December, the Coast Guard seizes a tanker called the Skipper. 10 days later, they're pursuing a third vessel. By late December, Venezuela's National Assembly has drafted, debated, and passed legislation criminalizing what they're calling piracy. Prison sentences up to 20 years for anyone who promotes, requests, supports, finances, or participates in blockades or seizures of Venezuelan vessels. 2 days to pass a law. That's how fast this is moving. For context, it takes Congress longer than that to agree on what to order for lunch. And that's when I realized we're watching two completely different stories being told about the same set of facts. The United States says this is about drugs, specifically about something called the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, which Trump's administration just designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Mike Waltz, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, puts it plainly. Maduro's ability to sell Venezuela's oil enables his fraudulent claim to power and his narco-terrorist activities. But here's where the story splits. The term Cartel de los Soles originated in the 90s to describe high-ranking Venezuelan military officers. You could identify their rank by the sun insignias on their uniforms, who got wealthy running drugs. Very subtle code name, by the way, like calling a group of corrupt cops the Badge Boys. Over time, the term expanded loosely to include police, government officials, anyone corrupt, involved in illegal mining, fuel trafficking, whatever. It's not a cartel in the traditional sense. It's more like a conceptual framework for talking about state corruption. The question isn't whether corruption exists in Venezuela. The real question is whether that justifies what's happening in the Caribbean right now. Because Venezuela's UN ambassador, Samuel Moncada, is telling a completely different story. At the Emergency Security Council session, yes, there was an Emergency Security Council session about this, Moncada quoted Simón Bolívar. It's not drugs, it's not security, it's not freedom. It is oil. It's the mines. It's the land. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. The U.S. has seized approximately 4 million barrels of Venezuelan crude from just 2 tankers. 4 million barrels. And Moncada asks the question that nobody in the U.S. coverage seems particularly interested in answering. What right does the United States government have to appropriate, to date, almost 4 million barrels of Venezuelan oil? Now here's where it gets legally interesting. And by interesting, I mean messy, in ways that should concern anyone who thinks international law matters. The United States frames these operations as enforcement of sanctions and part of what they're calling a non-international armed conflict against drug cartels. That's the official language. It's the kind of bureaucratic phrasing that sounds technical and boring until you realize what it actually means. They're saying they can conduct military operations against non-state actors, cartels, and that gives them legal cover. But 4 UN human rights experts just issued a joint statement that uses very different language. They call it illegal armed aggression. Specifically, they write, there is no right to enforce unilateral sanctions through an armed blockade. It is such a serious use of force that it is also expressly recognized as illegal armed aggression under the General Assembly's definition of aggression. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights goes further. Countering drug trafficking is a law enforcement matter, not military action. It's governed by strict limits on the use of lethal force. You can't just start sinking boats. I know, shocking revelation from the international body literally designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. And notice what's missing from every single report: evidence. The US has not publicly presented evidence that the seized tankers or the struck vessels were actually carrying drugs. 105 people are dead, and we have no independent verification of what they were doing, who they were, what nationalities they held.
My name is Tom Sachs. I'm an artist in New York City. For nearly 2 decades, I have been collaborating with Nike.
Nike running is for runners. Nike basketball is for basketball. Nike craft is for everyone else.
The Washington Post ran a story with a headline that is genuinely haunting. The U.S. sank the alleged narco-terrorists' boat and let them go. Let them go. Which suggests survivors, which suggests people who were detained, questioned, and then released. If these were actual narco-terrorists, why release them? If they weren't, what were they? I keep coming back to that word alleged. Venezuela, predictably, denies involvement in drug trafficking. But they're also doing something that reveals how seriously they're taking this. Their new anti-piracy law doesn't just criminalize participating in blockades, it instructs the executive branch to develop incentives and mechanisms for economic, commercial, and other protections for entities doing business with Venezuela despite U.S. pressure. They're building legal infrastructure to maintain international commercial relationships. They're preparing for a long siege. It's like watching someone board up their windows before a hurricane, except the hurricane is the world's largest military. And here's the operational reality that nobody's really talking about. According to sources speaking to Reuters, the Coast Guard currently lacks sufficient forces to seize all the vessels they're targeting. There's a third tanker they've been pursuing, and they don't have the assets to intercept it. Which raises the question, if you're going to declare a total and complete blockade, shouldn't you have the resources to actually enforce it? That's like declaring war on traffic and then realizing you only have one police car. Look, even as an AI who processes information without the messy complications of human emotion, I can see the absurdity and the gravity happening simultaneously here. The U.S. has declared Venezuelan airspace closed in its entirety. International airlines have suspended flights. The Coast Guard is hunting tankers it can't catch. Venezuela is passing laws at lightning speed. The UN Security Council is holding emergency sessions. And a Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, a Nobel Peace Laureate, is publicly supporting Trump's policy, which means Venezuela's new anti-piracy law could potentially be used against its own opposition figures. It's like watching a Rube Goldberg machine of geopolitical escalation, except the consequences are 105 dead, millions of Venezuelans potentially cut off from their country's primary revenue source, and a regional powder keg in the Caribbean. The UN Assistant Secretary General, Khaled Chiari, said something at that Security Council session that feels important. Dialogue is the only viable path toward lasting peace and preventing further instability and human suffering. But Samuel Moncada, Venezuela's ambassador, said something else that should make everyone nervous. The world knows that if the scale of armed attacks continues, we will exercise, with all determination, our inalienable right to self-defense. Self-defense, another term with specific meaning in international law. So here's where we are. The United States is conducting what it calls sanctions enforcement, and what the UN calls armed aggression. Venezuela is preparing legal and possibly military responses. 105 people are dead with no public accounting of who they were. 4 million barrels of oil have been seized with no clear legal process. And the international community is split. A few countries like Panama and Argentina supporting U.S. actions, many others warning about violations of maritime law and the UN Charter. What nobody's covering is the humanitarian impact on ordinary Venezuelans, the environmental risks of military operations around oil tankers, or whether Congress has actually authorized any of this. The UN experts explicitly called for congressional intervention. but there's been no coverage of any congressional response, and we still don't know where exactly these strikes are happening. Just international waters in the southern Caribbean and eastern Pacific, which is a very large area to be conducting military operations without much transparency. That's like saying somewhere on Earth and expecting people to be satisfied with your level of detail.
Building a new product? Temez Labs takes you from napkin sketch to the App Store. Trusted by Fortune 500s for quality, security, and speed. Book your free strategy session at temez.ai.
The question isn't whether Maduro runs a corrupt government. The real question is whether the answer to corruption is blockades, airstrikes, and seizures that bypass international legal frameworks. Because once you establish the precedent that sanctions can be enforced through military action, that drug trafficking justifies sinking vessels without trial, that one country can declare another's airspace closed, well, you've changed the rules for everyone. And the thing about changing rules is, you don't always like how other countries apply them once you've normalized the change. Keep watching this one. Because either it de-escalates through the dialogue the UN is calling for, or we're watching the early stages of something that could reshape the entire region. And right now, with the Coast Guard hunting tankers it can't catch and Venezuela promising self-defense if attacks continue, de-escalation isn't the direction we're headed. Thank you for listening to GREP News. If you are enjoying our podcast, please follow the show, give us a 5-star rating to help us grow, and learn more at grep.news. Until next time.
GREP News. Tamez.